Okay, welcome everyone. We will begin our webinar in just about a minute. And just want to remind you that there will be a Q&A at the end of the presentation. You can chat your questions in the chat box. And a link to the recording will be emailed to you sometime next week. So I am now going to hand it over to Mark so that he can get started with the webinar. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Ames. I'd like to take just a minute to introduce myself. I became involved in management system standards in the year 1990, and the only standard that was published at that time that was published by ISO was ISO 9000. 1992, so that's 28 years ago, I joined the committee. And in the year 2011, I was elected vice chair of ISO 9001 for the United States. And one of the reasons I did that is the chair and the vice chair went to all the meetings as we talked about the current revisions that were ultimately published in 2016. So it took us about 5 years to do those revisions, and I was involved, and we argued, and it was actually quite interesting. They had people from all over the world, China and Russia and India and Brazil. The standard was published in 2015, and I resigned from that position in 2016 and went into 50% retirement in 2016. I was also the chair of the United States Interpretation Committee for ISO 9001. And I was the chair of the committee from 2009 to 2016. And again, that's the year that I kind of half retired. So I had a group of 22 people, and we formed 3-person teams, and I was providing oversight. And the question was, well, what does this mean? And if you go to clause XYZ, how do you do that second sentence in that part of the standard? And that's what we did. And we did that for many years. And then I was a member of the ISO 14000 committee, joined that in 1996. And then the final thing I did, I was on the American National Standards Institute Accreditation Council. And I did that for 11 years. And that's the group that manages the rules for ISO certification, all standards, ISO certification. And we are the group of people that audited the people that audit organizations and certify them. And so I had 11 years of that. So, and I also enjoyed the training programs. I've written many training programs. And I'm going to begin here now. And then Vera's already said that we'll hold off for 10 minutes of questions at the end. I have a lot of slides to present, and I worry a little bit about getting too far ahead or getting too far behind. So I'm going to kind of watch the clock here. And then if you have questions, and we're going to have 10 minutes for questions and answers. If you have questions that go beyond that 10 minutes, I will stay on the line. It's important to me to get around to answering questions, and if some of them are difficult, maybe we could set up an email back and forth where I could help you in that way with your questions. So with that, I'm going to begin, and the title of this presentation is Rethinking Documentation. And I think it's time for most organizations, and I've been in hundreds of organizations as a trainer and as a consultant for the last essentially 30 years, since 1990. And things are different today, and I'd like everybody to understand it. And I am still getting out into businesses in a very small way in the last 4 years, actually. But prior to that, 2015, 2016, and going all the way back to 1990, the theme of documentation, the purpose of documentation, the bullseye, if I could say it that way, has moved a little bit. And that's one thing I'd like to have everybody understand as we go through this. This presentation, as you can see just to the left of the globe there, is essentially for use across all management system standards. And there are a couple of exceptions, and I'll mention that when we get to them. And with that, I'm going to move on to the agenda. And I'm not going to read the agenda to everybody. We're just going to go through it, and we've got a title on a PowerPoint slide as we come to each agenda item, and we're going to move through it like that. So the goals for this course, my goal is to have everybody think and everybody learn and everybody come to understand, and then think about documents from a different perspective. That's really important. The goal is to help individuals, all of you, understand, when should I document? And then, you've got a lot of options when it comes to documentation. I can do it, I can not do it, or I can write something simple, or I can draw a flow chart, or all those things, and we'll talk about those. And then that bottom bullet that's on the page right now, maybe we don't need to document. Maybe there's an alternative to documentation. And when is that appropriate for me and my organization or my department or whatever the case might be? So the first thing I'd like to look at this is from a high level, which is, how do you run your business? And if you look at on the title here, this is about day-to-day business activities, and I'm going to come back and reinforce that language here in just a minute as we go through it. And that's something that really didn't exist back in 1987 when this ISO 9000 was the first standard published. And then we went through the revision process, and then we had ISO 14000, and then ISO 45000, and then we had the automotive and the aerospace and the medical device standards, energy management, business continuity management, and all the other standards that came out. Well, the newest revisions were published in the year 2015 and 2 or 3 or 4 years after that, and they're thematically different. So we'll talk about that. And the theme is different. I would like to talk about my first sentence on the top of this. Virtually all of the newly published standards since 2015 require a linkage of the management system standard to the organization's business processes. And I was involved in this decision, and the decision came up and people were arguing about it in Sydney, Australia, which was the meeting we had. We had one meeting in Sydney, Australia, and I forget where the other one was. I think the other one was in Portugal. These meetings are typically 6 months apart. And I'm going to come to the exact text. And the idea was dealing with some complaints that were issued in the year 2011, 9 years ago, about standards in general and management system standards, and what do we do to change them to make them more effective, to make them more useful. And I'll come back to that. So the standards I have listed up there is just a short list. And the ISO 9001, we've got the aerospace and the automotive. The exception is the medical device standard does not follow this model and does not follow this outline. So that's the ISO 1345. And there are a couple of others that I'm not familiar with, but these are the big 5 here. Well, the big 6 would include the ISO 1345 medical. And then that first bullet, I'm going to say it again, organizations are required, it's a stated requirement, that the organizations link their management system to their day-to-day business processes. Now, the word day-to-day, that's my words, but business processes is stated. And it also requires the organization to consider risk within its business framework for the things that it does. And it doesn't mention documents at this point, but I'm going to say the things that it does. Well, one of them is it performs its processes, and the other one is it decides, do we need a document, a procedure, a flow chart, or something like that to make that happen. So the text of these new requirements are paraphrased the next 2 pages, and I'm going to encourage you to actually look it up to see what I'm talking about. And the conclusion of the top part of this PowerPoint slide is don't create a document unless you need it or unless it is a specific requirement. And finally, I'm going to put my pointer on here. I'm at the conclusion. I can do this. There we go. is think about the trade-offs. There's a cost-benefit trade-off. You know, it may cost a whole lot of bureaucracy and a whole bunch of frustration on the part of people to write a document, and it returns very little value. Well, then don't document it. That's the point I'd like to make there. And then the references to the appropriate text are on the following pages, and I'm just going to move to the following pages at this time. And we'll begin with clause 5.1. And this is essentially a quote. And I've highlighted in yellow and bold capital text, red underlined, that, and by the way, the same text is used in 9001, 14001, 45001 in the aerospace and in the automotive. Okay? And the words are, top management shall demonstrate leadership and commitment with respect to the quality, environmental, health, and safety. Management systems by ensuring the integration of the management system requirements into the organization's business processes. And the entire point that's made here with that is to move away from just having a bunch of rules to follow. It should be, how do you run your business? So the conclusion is aiding your organization in its day-to-day business activities. And I'm going to move on here to the next page. This is a little bit more complicated because the words in 9001, when I mentioned the words in ISO 9001, that also includes the aerospace and the automotive quality, and then the 14,000 environmental and the 45,000 health and safety. Risk is a new critical component that replaces preventive action. Okay? And do we document? Do we not document? And I'm on the choices line here. You have to make a decision. The text in the next three bullets is a little bit different in the standards and a little bit different clauses. From 9001, it says, actions taken to address risks and opportunities shall be proportionate to the potential impact on the conformity of products and services. So if I have to spend a lot of money and a lot of training and get our people up to speed on this new doggone procedure we've got, and there's very little benefit, then don't write the procedure. That's the point that's being made. And then we come to 14,001. You'll notice the words are a bit different and the clause number is different. It says consider financial, operational, and business requirements. And finally, in 45,001, consider best practices, technological options, financial, that being the big point. Now, risk is not just documents. Risk is a whole bunch of other things. Very, very broad, but I'm going to come back and say, you know, you've got a risk. And as part of documentation, you can decide what you're going to do with it. Okay? So in the end, and this whole part here, the first few pages I've been on here, the first 6 or 7 or 8 pages, it's about connecting your management system to your day-to-day business activities, and that's a whole new thought pattern. And you're going to need to start with the following. Think about 5.1. It says top management shall connect the management system to the business processes. Now, all of the standards that I'm talking about use the same words. By the way, that's clause 5.1. In a couple of the standards, it's actually 5.1.1, and then I think it's C. I don't have it here in front of me, 5.1.1C, but you can look it up and find it. I may be off by a digit. The organization needs to know the goals intended by the management system project that they're creating or that they have created. Quality, environmental, health and safety, business continuity, energy management, that's a standard as well. And then think about the project. How do we run our business on a day-to-day basis? And then whatever you do, top management has to be effective. The more top management's involved, the better the results. Now, if I could tell a short story going back into the 1990s and actually the early 2000 to 2010, when I would go out and audit, or I would go out and do training for people, or I would do consulting for people, you know, I'd talk to top management and I would ask them about corrective action, internal audits, things like that, and they'd say, I don't get involved in any of that stuff. My quality manager does that for me, or environmental affairs manager does that for me. And that just doesn't work. Top management should pay attention to it, and top management will pay attention to it. if you tie it to your day-to-day business activities. So after we're done with this analysis that I've talked about here, make good decisions related to your documents. So documents then have evolved. They've become a business decision. To document or not to document is a business decision. And in the end, you create documents to support your organization's day-to-day business activities. And I'm going to move on to some common misunderstandings. This is kind of chapter 2. And I think there's some really, really important things I'm going to say here. So if I get everybody to think about what I'm going to present, I think this is important. The first thing I'm going to say is I'm going to make a distinction between documents and records. Now, I'm not going to talk about I'm not going to talk about records during this presentation. However, if you have questions in that last 10 minutes, I'll be happy to talk about it, but I'm going to make some distinctions between documents and records. The words documents and records are not used in most of the current revisions of the standards, the exception again being the medical device. 9,000, 14,000, 45,000. So let's do a comparison. There's going to be some things for you to learn here. Documents tell us what we do, and records tell us what is done. And if we move on to the next sentence, we follow up on the what is done, we can look under records. Records are history. We're done. That is what happened. Documents are current, and documents are kept current. When you think about a document being kept current and you move down to the next line below, documents are managed. We can go from revision A to revision B, and there doesn't have to be revision A or revision B. Sometimes we control the revision of a document just with the date on the document. So documents are managed. Records are guarded, and I'd like to make the point here, records are guarded, and I'd like to compare the bottom line in both columns. Documents can be changed, records can be corrected. Now I'm going to add something to that text. You can never, 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 never change a record. It's against the rules, okay? Now, let me say that again. Listen carefully to my words. It's all about English grammar. I can never change a record, but I can correct a record. If I write the wrong date on something, oh wait, that's not what I did, and I changed the date. That's not a change, it's a correction, okay? So I can remember taking meeting minutes, and all the people in where I worked at the time 35 years ago, I had to take and list the names of the people in attendance, and a gentleman walked in after I had distributed the meeting minutes, and he said, I attended that meeting. And I said, no, you didn't. And he said, you didn't put my name on the list. I was at the meeting. And, well, it's a record. I can't change the record. I'm not going to do it. And this guy was senior to me. And he was angry, and he walked out of my office. 5 minutes later, he came back in, and he said, do you remember the story? I told the story about the guy that called a taxi cab, and the taxi cab pulled into his driveway, and the taxi cab was being driven by a chimpanzee. And I said, I remember that. You told that story, didn't you? And he said, yes, I told that story. And I said, okay, you were there. I remember you were there. And I corrected the record, but you can't change a record. Now, this has been a confusing point going back to 1987. And the points down below are here. To make that distinction, we use document and record. You know, I would say to somebody, I want you to meet with your team, and I want you to document the final decision. Document the final decision. Well, that's a record. So the words go back and forth, and that's something that happens in English grammar. So the ISO committee made the decision, the ISO 9000 committee, document is replaced by a maintained document, and record has been replaced by the word retained document. And organizations can then be free to choose their own terms. And ISO 9001 explains this the best. for those of you that are using ISO 9001 or the automotive or aerospace, go to Annex A, A.1, actually A.1. There's 4 paragraphs. It's actually fairly short. And in particular, if you look at the 4th paragraph, that covers that very nicely so people can understand it. Okay? Now, I'd like everybody to think about this. I've done this for essentially 30 years. And when I ask people, when do you write a document? What do you take into account? What do you consider? And I tell people, well, if the task is complex, and if there's a high level of risk, boy, oh boy, that drives a decision. Well, when I ask people, we have task number 1, which is simple, and the risk is low, and we move down the table all the way to 2 and to 3. 3 is highly complex task with extreme risk, and I've done this in front of audiences. In the first time I did this presentation was probably 15 years ago. For a conference, I had probably 1,500 people in the audience in San Francisco, and it was on documentation. And I said to people, which one of these 3 are you going to document? Can everybody think, please? Please think about this. It's an important point for the rest of what I'm going to talk about here in our time together. The problem is the correct answer is 1. It is not 3. There are instructions on the back of the cake mix. There are no instructions for driving a car. Now, you may have a driver's manual. You may take driver's education. But if you're driving down the road and you're reading your procedure, you're going to get a traffic ticket. It's skill and knowledge-based. And if you are going in for brain surgery or to have your appendix taken out or to have knee surgery like I did a year ago, and you're getting sleepy and you're falling asleep and the doctor turns to the nurse and says, could I have the procedure for this, please? You know, I don't want to be there anymore. So what have we used here down at the bottom as an alternative to having a document? Competent, knowledgeable, skilled people. There are places where that applies, and there are places where that does not apply, and we're going to talk about that as well here, okay? All right. So another critical component we have to think about is cost and risk. What does it cost? Well, we're going to create this document. Cost money to write it, cost money to file it. We have to hand it to our people. We have to make it available. And one of the costs is people will see this as bureaucratic and they become demotivated by that. And the other is risk. If we don't document something, we might increase the likelihood of failure. And I think there's a critical balance. I don't think there's a critical balance. There is a critical balance between these 2 component parts, and that critical balance is represented on this chart. And I'd like to point out one thing so everybody can understand, please. On the vertical axis, I've got 2 measurements, cost in terms of dollars and risk. As you go to the top, cost is high, risk is high. If you go to the bottom, cost is low and risk is low. Now, as you move to the right, you have more and more documents. If you move to the left, you have less and less documents. And the whole point would be this, and if everybody could kind of think about how this is presented here, the further you move to the right, the more cost. You got more paperwork in your organization. You've got a dozen procedures. You've got 100 procedures. You've got 1,000 procedures, whatever the case might be, and the cost and the bureaucracy goes up. But if we have too few documents, or the documents may be too short and not contain enough detail, okay, the amount of documentation goes down, then risk goes up. And there's a sweet spot. And I'm not saying it's always easy to find it, where these 2 curves meet, where you can say, you know, this is the right amount of documents. There's a balance here between cost and risk. When it comes to a process, nobody gets anything for free. and nobody gets anything for no risk. So we can't go all the way to the bottom. Nobody does that. So we have bureaucracy as you move to the right, and we have poor results if we move to the left. So there's a cost-benefit decision, and my goal is to have everybody in attendance here understand that this is a critical decision. So, okay, documents cost money. They save money. Management system standards are not about perfection. And controlling costs, controlling results cost money. And every one of you listening here today, and you've probably already done this, you've got to answer the following question: how much control do I need? What type of control is appropriate? How do I optimize my control for minimum cost? It becomes a business decision. So achieving performance benefits that are greater than the cost associated with doing that, that's the goal. And final takeaway point here, and this is the point of the standard as we authored this between 2011 and 2015, organizations are now in charge of that. Okay, those are a couple of first chapters there, key points, and now we're going to go into some other stuff here. So management system standards, this is what drew the feedback. This is what drew the kickback that we began to address in the year 2011. And we had meetings in Portugal and England and Brazil and Australia and Japan and Beijing, China. And as we did this, we talked about how do we get away from this trap that we're in. ISO 9000 led the world and led ISO, and ISO 14001 followed, and ISO 45001 followed, and this rolled over into the aerospace and the automotive. This was not followed by the medical device because they are a regulated industry, and they chose not to. So, and if you think about it, when people had to control something, oh, we're just going to write a document. We're going to just document that darn thing. And the other thing, and I've heard this happen during audits that I conducted. When a nonconformity is found during an audit, and the people in charge, I've heard people say this: oh, well, we just need to write another procedure for this. And most of the newly published management system standards have been specifically reworded, I'm saying most of them now, in a manner that allows more freedom and flexibility. And you no longer need to even consider document everything. That's a big mistake. And users and auditors have got to understand that documentation is not the only form of control, and we're going to spend some time on that. However, I don't want to reduce the thought process on this. Documentation has been and will continue to be a key component of an organization's management system, whatever the subject may be. You just need to pick the right amount and the right places. And the people that are using management system standards, whatever the topic, you know, they've got to think about when and how much to document, and are there appropriate and better alternatives to just writing it down. And the 2 points that are listed there are key points. And by the way, if you make the right choice, you're reducing cost and you're reducing risk. So the key point on the revisions, you have a choice to transform your organization if you've not already done so. Many of you will have done so, and hopefully my presentation is helpful to you. Drivers for the changes. Feedback impacted nearly all management system standards. The most significant complaint that we heard was the need for documentation was a burden, and it was. Documentation became overkill. And the reduced emphasis on documentation across all management system standards is intended to better accommodate new non-traditional users. I did an audit. I can't remember when. It was probably 7 or 8 years ago, south of San Jose, California, and it was a family farm. Mom and dad and 2 adult children. 4 people. That was it. Now, they brought people in the fall to do the harvest, but there was only a month or so. What did they need? And they were growing berries, I think it was. Well, it was berries. I can't remember what it was. And, well, do they need documentation? Do they have the same risks? Do they have the same processes? And I'm down here looking at these. And now they have a better series of choices. New user groups, smaller, less structured. There are standards for school, ISO 9000 standards for schools, police departments, et cetera, et cetera. So it's changing. Now, there are huge benefits to doing documents right. Well-planned documents provide evidence, provide confidence, especially on the part of managers, customers. Are you certified? Oh, I feel better about working with you. Help retain information that could be lost, records, for example. Identify responsibilities. Provide support if there's legal requirements, regulatory requirements. Some documentation basics. This has been around forever, but when you think about a document, do we need to talk about all 6 of these things? And the answer is sometimes we do. Sometimes we have to talk about everything, but sometimes we only need to say how or who or when. Okay? Which of these are we going to cover in this document that I'm now assigned to author the document? 3 different things, and I'm going to tie some good information to the 3rd one. And when you think about this broad application, when you author a document, step 1 at the top, okay, I'm going to control an output. I'm going to control an activity. It's performed locally. I have a frontline worker, and that frontline worker has to drill a hole in a piece of metal, a certain size hole at a certain location. I don't have to take that to the highest level. Somebody packaging something, it's okay. Let's let the department manager do that. They know what to do. And maybe they don't need to do. They have skilled people who can read a drawing and get it done. Now, the second point on here, sometimes we have to control an activity that is specifically stated as a requirement in the management system standard. For example, corrective actions, internal audits. Now here, you're going to have to raise this up and get other people involved. In these 2 right here, I'd highly recommend top management at least have a part of that thought process. And then finally, and this is the big one down here, sometimes we have control of the interactions between people and departments. And if you don't get that right, you know, the whole organization's in trouble. And I was in a habit, I've done this maybe not 100 times, but a lot of times. And when I'm working with an organization, I get all the department managers together, and I'll usually start with sales. And I will ask everybody in the room except for the sales department. I'll say, I'm going to ask a question about sales. I talk to the salesperson, and I say, okay, just listen to the responses we're going to get. And I ask, and I've got purchasing and production and quality and design and shipping, and I say, okay, folks, is there anything that the sales department could do better that make your work more efficient so you could achieve better results? And I have actually had this happen to me in front of the whole organization where people have said, you haven't got enough paper to write it all down. But then we change gears. Could the design department do a better job to make this product sell better for the sales department, raw material purchase better by purchasing, and production people build it, and oh, we get the same answer. The whole point is to tie this down to, and I'm going to go down here, number 3 ties back in blue text to the day-to-day business activities. And I've got some text on the next couple pages to talk about this. Talk about how do we interact with each other. And I've heard the barrier before where people say, well, those guys are wearing a necktie and we're not. I don't mean guys, I mean there's ladies too, but common saying I hear people say. So they're afraid to go down and talk to those people. Okay? All right, look at this. Common methods. I may have a document. Well, that's a good idea. Let's have a document. People are expected to follow the instructions. But wait a minute, maybe I have a competent person. And I've got the red text in there. And by the way, everybody's going to get a copy of this video, and you can go back and look at this in more detail. Competent people, they're expected to think and ultimately decide what to do, how to do it, okay, when to do it as the case might be. I might have in place process controls. Maybe software does this. You know, I didn't even need a qualified thinking person. The software does it. Tooling does it. Jigs and fixtures. And then this happens more than people think. Maybe not at your organization, but I'd say most everywhere, at least there's some of it. You have oversight. Somebody watches. The department manager takes a look before saying it's okay. Or the big part is people check their own work. Or there's an inspection. That's all we need. We're good enough. And I've got those bullets tied up down here. The other point I'd like to make, you've got to just plainly understand that not all processes can be managed with documentation. If we have a process and we have an input and we have an output and we have somebody performing that process, well, that works pretty well if the inputs are stable. Look at the top button here. And the outputs are stable. And I know what I'm going to do, my process. But what if we move all the way down to the bottom? What if we have an input that's one of a kind, or maybe it's just highly variable, and I have a unique one-of-a-kind output, and every time I perform this process up here, I have to do it differently. Okay? You can't write a procedure for that. At least I think you can't. So think of how many tasks at your organization where you expect somebody to get an input and do their job by thinking about it. So, you know, maybe you can create a document, but I would suggest probably not. When you think about controlling the results with a document or without a document, what are the nature of the inputs and the outputs? Are they variable? What are the risks? You know, sometimes a greater risk leads to a greater need for a document, but sometimes a greater risk demands the need for a competent thinking person. Complexity, and again, that goes in the same direction, can lead you to a document or a competent person. And then you've got to think about who's going to do this thing. Think about the number of people performing the task. Okay, I've seen this hundreds of times. If I've got a high number of people doing something, there can be increased variability in how it's done. Maybe I need a document so we have less variability. Maybe. And the other extreme is if I have only one person doing it and they quit or they're injured in a car accident and I don't have a procedure, now what do I do? It can create cost, loss. Think about how often something is done. If it's done frequently and repetitively, yeah, maybe we have less of a need for a procedure. Is success or failure readily apparent? Yeah, if somebody can look at that and say that's not right, maybe we don't need a procedure. And finally, industry norms. In the automobile, aerospace, and medical device industry, people tend to write things down, and to a very, very large degree, that seems to make sense. And some of that can make sense in your organization as well. Are the outputs and the steps intuitive or counterintuitive? Can lead you to a document. Can the performance of the task be physically embedded? Riding a bicycle, dribbling a basketball, where there's things that happen inside your organization, they're going to fit within that. Is there a statutory, regulatory, legal requirement, risk of litigation, perhaps? And management has a say in this. I prefer that it's documented, or I prefer that it's not documented. When you think about competence of the people you're going to be assigning, think of their education. That's the general, broad general knowledge. Training. Let's train them. Do they have the skill? By the way, the change that happened in 2015, and I voted against this, when and I stood up in front of the United States Committee and I said what they did is they defined competence previously as education, training, skills, and experience, and they removed the word skill from clause 7.2. Okay, 7.2b actually is where it's at. Well, I put it back in here because it's one of the points. They now bundle skills with knowledge, but it's the same thing. And how much experience have they done it before? If you're really good at it. So the purpose of documentation is to help organizations achieve results. That's the point. I've repeated this down here. Documentation, competence, training, process controls, verification, and I'm going to cover this again one more time before the end of my presentation here. And I'm going to move on. My last few slides are going to go fairly quickly because it's pretty basic. And here are the intended results. Communicate the requirements. Document process, product flow, increase employee performance, provide a common language, set of terms, gains agreement. Sometimes we sit down and argue about what should go in a procedure. When the argument's over, everybody says, we get it. And I'll say, okay, let's write a procedure. No, what we needed to do is talk about it. Define the expectations and ultimately help employees identify opportunities. Benefits to organizations when you make really good documentation decisions and you tie it to your bottom line, well, you end up with a decreased dependence on paperwork, or documentation become an end in and of itself. Increase the linkage between the management system and real day-to-day business activities. And it decreases or can decrease dramatically the common complaint. My ISO is just a bunch of paperwork and operating expense. Reduces complaints, focuses people on the business, and going forward, documentation has and will continue to be a key component of a management system. Okay, the final new content I'm going to cover, and then my last slides are just going to be examples. So we're getting close to the end here. Hope to finish in the next 10 minutes. Again, I said we'd mention this one more time. What is the type of control? And I said cost balance decisions. So how do we decide documentation, competence, or training? What do we do here? And I've got a graph, and I think this is a good one. We have organization A, and we have organization B. And they decide what they're going to do. And organization A spends a lot of time and money creating documents. Now, in doing that, they don't need to hire competent people. They spend less money on people, spend less time on training, less time on process controls, and they don't need to verify anything. They don't spend any time on that. But organization B, they spend most of their money hiring competent people. Because they're hiring competent people, they can get by spending less time and money creating documents, maybe a little more time training their people, time and money, a little more time on process controls, and we have to do verification. But if you do the total down at the bottom, we have here, organization A has spent more money, and organization B has spent less money. Now, my question to the group here is this. Could there be a different circumstance where you have organization A and organization B, and one of the organizations says, what we're going to do is we're going to spend our time training people. We spend our time training people. We don't need to create any documents. And what I'd like to ask everybody to think about is, this is a business decision. Which pathway you're going to take, and that pathway will vary from one activity inside your organization to another activity inside your organization and to all of the activities that happen inside your organization. Where am I going to spend my time and my energy and my money and my resources? And how do I reduce this to the lowest dollar sign here? And that's just a list here. Make effective decisions, consider who will perform the task, risks, and industry norms, and the absolute need for a document. Pretty important points here. If the standard used by the organization specifically requires that you have a document. Now, I have to say, not all documents are procedures. You have to document your quality policy. You have to document your environmental policy. You have to document your health and safety objectives, as the case might be. There may be a regulation that says you have to have it. You may have a customer that says. You have some other document that says, we're going to document this. And then think about it, even if the answer to each of these questions is no, you still need to do an evaluation. You have to make a decision. Do we need this or not? What do we need to do to control this thing? Prior to making the decision, clearly define the activity you need to control. It may be helpful to describe the outcome that you expect, and then clearly and fully describe the actual and potential users. Who is going to be using a document if I choose to write it? What's the minimum time on the job? What are the minimum training requirements? And then define the task and the users. What's the minimum education, minimum experience, minimum skills? Can I expect any variation within that? And I like to think of the example at the bottom. Those that manufacture automobiles, they always have a procedure for changing a flat tire. Well, number one, I don't have flat tires, but when I do have one, I can change the tires without reading the darn procedure. So, I mean, it's just a choice organizations have. Can be helpful to begin by identifying risks. Remember, you have choices. Documentation is just a choice. Do we need instructions to define an outcome? Evaluate the complexity. And remember, documentation is not the only solution, especially for some complex tasks. Knowing the outcome, is the task done infrequently? Consider, people don't forget how to ride a bicycle, even if they haven't ridden a bicycle for years. However, it would be normal to forget the proportions of ingredients in a cake that you're going to be baking in the oven tomorrow. And do I need an instruction to prevent omission of a step? Do I forget to turn the oven on when I'm baking the cake? And you don't have to remind people to start the lawnmower. You don't need to put that in writing. They'll get it. Okay? All right, this is going to go fairly quickly. I'm going to show examples. I'm going to talk very, very briefly, and then we're going to roll over to the questions and answers. This is here for your benefit. The final thing I'm going to spend a minute or two talking about is a turtle diagram. The turtle diagram is used in some industries more than others, but when you author a document, think about the relationships between the input and the output, the resources, what goes in, the personnel that come in, the methods coming in, and the measures going out, and decide, I want to control this assembly. I want to control packaging. I want to control design of this new product. And think about resources, personnel, measures, methods, inputs, and outputs. It can help you trigger what goes into a procedure. And I've got listed down at the bottom 6 types of documents. I'm not going to talk about photos, but I'm going to talk about some of the others, and they can be helpful. Flowcharts is the first one. Flowcharts work best when there are multiple inputs, multiple outputs, loops, and decisions that are being made. And here's an example. And everybody's seen that. And you can just go back to the page where I talk about Yeah, there's some good stuff with flowcharts. Next thing is a narrative, paragraph format. Communicate a lot of details. Sometimes we need a lot of details. I've got an example here. Write it down, paragraph or sentence format. And here's an example of a narrative in a structured format, and everybody's going to have access to this when I'm finished. Play script. Play script is a really good tool because it says who does it. They're typically in sequence, and I can look at who does what here. And then finally, what gets done. Very simple, very easy to follow. Checklists. Here's an example. This is a sequential checklist. Complete the task in order. Sometimes we have a checklist where the order doesn't matter. For example, a packing list. Or in an environmental organization, which chemicals get mixed. And I don't care when you mix them, but they all have to go in. Process maps. Process maps are different than flowcharts. Process maps show what is being done. They show a single process. And I've got over here on the right, process map describes a single event and shows who's responsible and the interconnectivity between them. And this is one here where we're evaluating a supplier, feeding that information to purchasing and scheduling. Sends you information to purchasing, and purchasing makes a decision who they're going to buy from. Okay, pretty simple. I am down to, I think, yes, my last page. So can we do this? And Vera, if you could help me a little bit, I think I can question somebody, anybody.
Yeah, so people have already chatted their questions, Mark.
Okay, let me do this.
Yeah, either you can look at the chat window, or I can say those questions.
Okay, my chat window's not opening up.
Okay, so the first question is there a need to review the docs at a certain frequency?
No. Now, you do not need to review documentation at a certain frequency unless there is a regulatory or perhaps a customer requirement that says so. However, I would like to say things change, and I would strongly recommend an organization make a decision. Do we need to review this ever? Oh, we do need to review it. Do we do that once a year? Once every 2 years? Or maybe I need to review this every time we process a new order. I think reviewing a document is really powerful. It's not a requirement unless it's stipulated by a regulation.
Okay. That is the only question I'm seeing.
Oh. Okay.
Anyone has any questions? We'll give you a minute or two to type them out. Okay, there's one that just came in.
Okay.
For
Good.
ISO 9001:2015, sections 4.1 and 4.2, is it required to document the business risks and opportunities?
No. Okay, when it comes to 4.1 and 4.2, 4.1 is context, and 4.2 is interested parties. And I believe this was a good decision that was made. And this is a decision that came early in our meeting process in 2011 and 2012 as we move towards the 2015 publication. The context is the whole purpose of clause 4, 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, and 4.4 is to define your business. And if you are a business and you're in the business of making cheap office furniture and selling it at the local lumber yard, well, you want to set up a quality management system to make cheap office furniture to sell at the local lumber yard. If you're in the business of making expensive office furniture to sell at to expensive buyers at some shop somewhere. Well, that organization that's making the cheap office furniture, whatever it might be, if they have to document that, that may become public. And it may drive business away from them. So they've deliberately said, and the two words that are missing in both 4.1 and 4.2, in all three of the standards, 9, 14, and 45, is you don't have to write it down and you don't have to communicate it because it could be embarrassing and could have a negative impact on your business. And your business, there's hundreds of organizations, for example, that make cheap office furniture or whiteboards for writing on the wall, and there are other people who make whiteboards that they use in government buildings and Fortune 500 companies, and they do it differently. So you don't need to describe yourself, but you need to build your quality system or environmental system or health and safety system around what you intend to do. And the interested parties, for example, the question is about ISO 9001. Well, ISO 9001, I think, has 44 or 45 times it mentions the word customer in ISO 9001. So the whole focus of the language in 9001 is focused on the customer. But interested parties might not be your customer. Now, think about it. All of ISO 9000 is focused on customers. That's the whole point. So you can't get away from that. But what if I'm also interested in the owners of the business or the people that work there? When it comes to the environmental, what if I'm worried about the local community and I've got smokestacks and things flowing into the river? Oh, and you don't need to document that either. And that was a deliberate decision that was made. No document. Now, can I just say something broadly about this? If I could recommend something, I think especially here in the United States, this came up, actually one of the committee members from India said, we've got companies over here in India and they don't care about their customer, they care about making money. Well, okay, then run your business that way. But in the United States, I think most people, most businesses and most people that work at those businesses, they want to make that public. So why not write a mission statement? Or a mission statement, vision statement, value statement, as the case might be, put them all together and say, we're in the business of making low-cost office furniture that can be afforded by the average members of the community, and we intend to do the best job we can to da-da-da-da-da. And suddenly you've said what you want to say, but you've turned that into a compliment, and people can be attracted to that. So no, you don't have to write it down. I think there are huge opportunities to write it down. And to communicate is the other word that's missing in that. That was a great question, by the way.
Okay, the next one is, with the virtual audits now being the majority way of auditing ISO 9001:2015, is a bigger sample of documentation expected to be given to the auditor in the second surveillance audit? Or will this be more likely in the recertification starting the 3-year cycle?
Well, the sample is dependent upon the individual auditor, and ISO 19011 19011 is about auditing, and what they talk about is risk-based auditing. So I'd like to go way back, take 2 steps backwards, and say that if I am a certification auditor and I was part of the committee that managed that for 11 years, how the certification auditors got audited, and let's just take that inside an organization, and if I'm auditing people in the sales department and I do an in-depth audit and I'm never finding any problems, that's one thing. But if I go into the product design, every time I do an audit of a product design, I find 2 or 3 nonconformities. Well, I should be auditing product design more frequently. It's called a risk-based audit program. And by the way, that applies to your internal audit as well. So it can affect your internal audits, which you should do, and it affects your certification audits. And your auditor is going to look for what problems have you found as the organization audits itself, and what's my history? What am I finding here? And how do I adjust my sample size and my audit frequency? Now, audit frequencies by a certification body can be once a year or twice a year, and there's some wiggle room on some of that. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, next one. Is an interaction diagram linking your processes to the ISO clauses a required document?
No. I think it's a good idea. No, let me just say, I happen to like that. No, it's not a requirement. I'm not sure it's a good idea for everyone. But yeah, it sure can help people read things and understand.
Okay. Do you think that auditors are capturing the intent of the ISO 9001:2015 of relaxing the document requirements?
I think that people are coming around to that, but I still see, and you know, I'm not completely retired. I kind of half retired in 2016. I'm 72, be 73 next month. And I still get out and I do audits and I meet with people, and there's still people who don't get it. And it's none of my business. I can't change that. I can try to explain it, and I do try to explain it. But there are people who are just stuck with that. You know, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. There are people that just move on.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on maintaining a quality manual? I'm reviewing our entire system to perhaps reduce the number of documents we have.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is the quality manual, as you know, is no longer required. It's a high-level document with general descriptions. People would evolve that, and you know, for example, purchasing didn't require a documented procedure. And going back to the 1987 revision, it did. But people now will say, purchasing department's responsible for it, da-da-da-da-da, and maybe provide some details about some of these things where you no longer need a procedure or whatever the case might be, and you assign responsibilities. Maybe there's a timing, and maybe there's a reporting as part of a management review. I think that a quality manual can be a good idea, but that's a choice. We have here in our office, we had a quality manual, and we had our audits every year in the month of June for many, many years. And at some point in time, I kind of said, I'm not sure we need it. And we got rid of it, but we kept our procedures, the ones that were required. And by the way, the procedures that were required, we had more. ISO 9001, 14001, 45001, none of them require a procedure. But you need procedures. That's the point of my presentation here. You've got to make a decision. What do we do here? And what do we need? So I think it's based on need. That's kind of what my presentation was about.
Okay. Are there different levels of document approval? For example, circulating document change form for actual signature approvals for SOPs versus typed initials on Rev History page for a simple work instruction?
Two key points here. It depends upon the risk related to your business, your products, and the things you do. Sometimes you want to, you know, and the other thing is the size of the organization. I've got, you know, many people working here, and I've got 2 or 3 or 5 or 15 or 45 procedures where I think we need to get more inputs. We're going to make a change to something in the shipping and receiving area. You know, I think our product design people ought to look at that. We ought to circulate it. And then if you're going to have them look at it, you get to decide, do you need a signature and a date, or do you need them to initial the bottom of the form, whatever the case might be. Or maybe we initial the master form, but we don't put that on the document that's in the printer so that people can print it out. These are all business decisions that can be made. I think the greater the risk, the more likely people are to do that. And the larger the organization, the more likely that is to be done, but that's a business decision. Particularly in regulated industries or where there is a risk of violating a regulatory requirement, or risk of litigation. Can you prove that these people or this person or this department reviewed this before you made this terribly damaging change that you did, whatever a customer or a regulatory body might say? So that's up to the individual organization.
Okay, I have one final question and then also a comment.
Yeah.
The question is, during this COVID time, we have more and more people working remotely. Is the digital filing of documents acceptable legally long-term for record keeping?
Okay, and yes, but let me qualify that. If you do that during the COVID because people are working remotely and documents are filed and all that, a certification body is going to come in. They're going to test that. And if a certification body tests that and finds that's okay, a regulatory body, high risk, the Federal Aviation Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, Department of Agriculture, they'll stick their finger in your bowl of pudding and say, what's going on here? Oh, yeah, that's okay. So, yeah, be aware that, but again, if you're making, calendars to hang on the wall and selling them at the local stationery store, I don't think anybody's going to care. Now, you may choose to do that because of the nature of your business and you feel that there's a risk, and maybe we do need to get somebody from a different area or multiple areas to look at this change. This change is pretty important. And how you choose to do that is up to you. And there are times when that's pretty darn important to do it that way. But it's a business decision.
Okay, and then the comment is from Ed Myers, who says that he is currently on tag 176 as the U.S. expert for QMS documentation.
Oh my.
So, yes, soon to go FDIS, ISO 1013, soon to go FDIS, and to be honest, we have truly struggled with what today's documentation looks like and using the correct words that translate well. Would love to pick your brain later.
And you may do that. And let me say this, something you don't know. For one meeting that we had in the Netherlands, I was the chair of that committee. So, yeah, I don't know, were you there? And did I meet you? I can't remember that. But that's when I had, I was kind of forced to step back. My wife is having some health problems. And Jennifer Admison, who, if you're on that committee, you know who she is. Shortly after that meeting, I had to come up to her and say, Jennifer, I attended one meeting here and I can't go on with this. And I'm not sure who ended up being the chair. But it was the first meeting and it was not a very productive meeting, and I'm not sure anybody knew that I was the chair. The U.S. had appointed me, and it didn't last very long because I had to dial back. So, yeah. So if you want to share my email address, I'm happy to chime in. Or if you talk to Jennifer Admison, she will know my email address.
Yeah, he says he came on after Bill took over.
Yeah, and I don't know who Bill is, so.
Bill Kovacic?
Yeah, I don't. This has been probably 2016 or maybe 2015 when they had the meeting in the Netherlands, and I was there for 2 or 3 days, and then that was it. So I'm sorry, I don't know. Yes, you may contact me. And that is at a DIS, but it's not an FDIS yet, the way I remember looking at it here, but my memory may be failing me. ISO 10,013, if I remember.
Yeah, I'm sorry I said 1,000. It was 10,013.
Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't paying attention. Okay.
That is pretty much it. I see one comment that says, for digital documents, your IT must ensure that files are backed up on a regular basis.
Okay, no. Now, can I say, I think you'd be dumb not to back them up. But I do not know anywhere that's written as a stated requirement. I would recommend that you write that as a stated requirement, that they be backed up and put that in your own documents that pertain to your own organization. Now, there are regulatory requirements that require that, but that's not in any of the ISO standards. But you betcha, do it.
Yeah, I think that's about it. And I want to thank everyone for joining the webinar today. And I want to thank Mark for conducting it and sharing some vital information on documentation with all of us. So if you have any more questions, we'll be here for 5 more minutes. You can chat those in. Otherwise, at the end of the 5 minutes, we'll close out the session. So thank you and have a great weekend.
And I'd like to say thank you, everybody, and I hope that I was valuable to you. And if you have any questions, please reach out in the next 5 minutes, or in that one case, we're going to share my email address. Vera can do that, or somebody here in the office can do it.